My name is Andrea Brooks. I'm 32, and I've spent 7 years as a physical therapist, the kind of work where you learn to read a patient's body the way most people read a sentence, instantly noticing the small hitch in a gait, the slight favoring of one side, the specific tension that tells you exactly where the real damage is hiding before they've said a single word about it. I know how to stay calm while someone else's body is failing them, because staying calm is the only thing that actually helps in that moment. I did not expect to need that particular calm standing at the base of my parents' mountain resort, watching search and rescue volunteers fan out into a whiteout, understanding with a cold, physical certainty that my 9-year-old daughter had been missing for 6 hours, and that my own parents had known exactly where she was for most of that time. She probably just wandered off the marked trail, my father said, his voice carrying the same calm, managerial authority he brought to every crisis at the resort he'd spent 30 years building, the specific tone of a man accustomed to reassuring nervous guests rather than a mother watching her child's tracks disappear into a storm. "Molly's a smart kid. She'll find shelter." I looked at him standing there, Dennis Brooks, Resort Operations Director, warm and composed in front of the small crowd of staff and volunteers who had gathered at the lodge's entrance, and I felt something in my chest go very still. Not the frantic, escalating panic I'd expected to feel, but something colder, more clinical, the same stillness I bring to a patient's chart when a symptom doesn't match the story I've been told about it. If you've ever watched someone you trusted deliver calm, confident reassurance about something that didn't actually add up, I need you to stay with me, because this story does not end where anyone at that resort expected it to. I want to explain what brought Molly and me to my parents' resort that weekend, because I don't think the moment at the base of that mountain carries its real weight without the context underneath it. I'd been a single mother for 4 years since Molly's father and I separated, building a quiet, steady life around physical therapy shifts and school pickups and the particular constant math of raising a child alone without much family support nearby. My parents' invitation that winter had felt, at the time, like a genuine gesture. A free weekend at the resort, time for Molly to bond with grandparents she rarely saw, a small break from the relentless logistics of solo parenting. I hadn't questioned it too closely. I wanted, the same way I think a lot of adult children of complicated parents want, to believe the invitation was simply generous rather than anything more complicated. I want to be honest, too, about the specific history that made me want to believe that so badly. My parents had never been particularly warm people, not in any conventional sense. My father measured most relationships by their usefulness to the resort's reputation, and my mother ran our household, growing up the same way she ran the resort's books, carefully, without much room for anything that didn't balance cleanly. I'd spent my entire childhood learning to be low maintenance, easy, undemanding, the specific survival skill of a child who understood early that neediness cost more than it was worth in that house. When they'd called, out of nowhere, offering this weekend, some small, hopeful part of me had let myself believe they were finally, belatedly, trying to be the grandparents Molly deserved. If you've ever accepted an unexpected olive branch from difficult parents, wanting so badly for it to be genuine that you didn't examine it too closely, comment, "Hope makes us careless sometimes," below. Molly had been thrilled the entire drive up, camera in hand. A small digital camera I'd given her for her birthday. Her latest obsession, documenting everything from pine cones to the resort's retired search and rescue dog, Coda, a graying, gentle German shepherd my father kept around the property more as a mascot than an active working animal these days. She'd spent the first full day of our visit trailing Coda around the grounds, snapping photos of everything, including, I would only later understand, several restricted maintenance areas she'd wandered into entirely by accident, following the dog rather than any trail marker. I remembered that first evening, my father's expression shifting briefly when Molly showed him a few photos from her camera at dinner, proud of a shot she'd gotten of Coda sitting beside some kind of storage structure near the property's northern edge. "That's a maintenance area, sweetheart," he'd said, his voice carrying a specific, controlled tightness I hadn't fully registered at the time. "You shouldn't really be wandering back there. Not safe with all the equipment." I'd thought nothing of it in the moment, a reasonable parental correction about a child exploring somewhere she shouldn't have. I understand now, with the clarity that only comes after everything else has unraveled, that my father's tightness that evening had nothing to do with equipment safety and everything to do with exactly what might have been visible in the background of whatever Molly had photographed. If you've ever looked back at an ordinary, happy family weekend and realized later exactly which small moment had actually set everything in motion, comment "I know that feeling" below. This story is for you. Molly went missing on our second afternoon, sometime between lunch and the early winter dusk, last seen by a member of the housekeeping staff wandering toward the resort's northern service road with Coda trotting beside her. By the time I noticed she hadn't returned to the lodge, the storm that had been building all afternoon had already closed in fully, visibility dropping to almost nothing, and my father's mountain patrol supervisor, a careful, uneasy man named Joel Carter, organized a search crew with a speed that struck me, even in my panic, as somehow both urgent and strangely rehearsed. I stood in the lodge's entryway, pulling on every layer of winter gear I could find, watching my father direct search volunteers toward the main trail system with the same confident, practiced authority he brought to every crisis at the resort. And something in me, some instinct I hadn't yet let myself fully name, noticed how carefully his instructions avoided any mention of the Northern Service Road at all. "We'll find her," my mother, Paula, told me, her hand on my shoulder, her voice carrying the same steady, managing calm my father had used minutes earlier. Paula ran the resort's finances with the same meticulous, unshakable control she brought to everything, and I noticed, even through my fear, the particular way both my parents kept redirecting the search teams away from a specific stretch of the property, a closed maintenance road near the northern ridge, an area Joel mentioned once, only to have my father cut him off and redirect the conversation toward the main trail system instead. "Why aren't we searching near the northern ridge?" I asked, my voice climbing despite every effort to keep it level. "That area's been closed for maintenance," my father said smoothly. "She wouldn't have gone that way. The trail markers are clear." I didn't fully understand, standing there in the freezing dark, with searchlights sweeping uselessly through blowing snow, exactly why my father's explanation left a specific, cold unease sitting in my stomach that had nothing to do with the storm. My hands, I noticed, had gone perfectly steady in the exact way they always did during a crisis at work, the clinical calm taking over precisely because the panic underneath it had nowhere useful to go yet. A man I didn't recognize approached me near the equipment shed while search teams organized their next sweep, introducing himself quietly as Mark Ellis, the resort's safety and inventory manager. He glanced back toward my father before speaking, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. "I filed a safety complaint about that northern maintenance road 2 months ago," he said. "Your father told me it was being handled. I don't think it ever was. I don't know if that means anything right now, but I thought you should know, given where your daughter was last seen." I stared at him, the cold suddenly feeling considerably less like weather and more like something settling permanently into my chest. "Handled how? What kind of complaint?" "I'd rather not say more here," he said, glancing again toward the lodge, toward my parents. "But if this search doesn't go the way it should, I want you to know I'll tell you everything. I should have pushed harder 2 months ago. I'm not making that mistake again." He walked away before I could ask anything further, leaving me standing in the snow with a specific, sharpening dread that had nothing to do with wilderness survival odds, and everything to do with the particular cold suspicion that whatever danger waited for my daughter on that mountain, my own parents had known about it long before tonight. Joel Carter found me a few minutes later, clipboard in hand, his expression carrying the particular strain of a man caught between professional obligation and something he clearly didn't feel comfortable saying outright. "Ma'am, I want to be straightforward with you," he said, keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry toward the lodge. "I recommended we expand the search perimeter to include the Northern Service Road 20 minutes ago. Mr. Brooks overruled that recommendation. I don't have the authority to push back further than I already have, but I wanted you to know that recommendation was made and overruled on the record." "Why would he overrule that?" I asked, though some cold, clinical part of me already understood I wasn't going to like whatever answer eventually surfaced. "I don't know," Joel said, and I believed, watching his face, that this particular answer was honest, even if I suspected he had his own private theories he wasn't yet willing to voice aloud. But I've logged the recommendation and the overrule both, with timestamps. Whatever happens next, there's a record of exactly what I suggested and exactly what your father decided instead. I thanked him, understanding, even in the depths of that freezing, panicked night, that Joel's careful documentation and Mark's quiet warning were the first two pieces of something considerably larger than a missing child in a storm. The first two pieces of a pattern I was only beginning to recognize, one small, uneasy confirmation at a time that my own parents had chosen something else, whatever it was, over my daughter's safety, long before the search had even properly begun. It would take hours more, and considerably more than my father's calm reassurance, before I understood exactly what that unease had actually been trying to tell me. If you've ever had a parent's calm reassurance feel wrong in a way you couldn't yet name, comment "Trust your gut" below. Chapter 2 is where I start understanding exactly what my parents already knew. Molly was found 11 hours after she first went missing, not by the search teams my father had directed toward the main trail system, but by a volunteer who finally pushed past protocol and checked the Northern Service Road on his own initiative, following fresh paw prints in the snow that led to a small maintenance shed near the property's boundary line. She was hypothermic, frightened, and alive, curled against Coda's side in a narrow gap between the shed's outer wall and a stack of stored equipment. The old dog's body heat, apparently the only thing that had kept her from freezing during the hours the official search had spent combing entirely the wrong terrain. The volunteer who found her, a young man named Curtis who worked part-time on the mountain patrol, told me later, quietly, that he'd noticed Coda's paw prints diverging from the main trail almost an hour into the search, but had been redirected twice by senior staff before he'd finally decided to check the maintenance road on his own, against direct instruction. "I don't know why they kept pulling us away from that area," he said. "I just know if I hadn't finally gone anyway, we might not have found her in time." I didn't sleep that first night in the hospital, sitting beside Molly's bed, watching her small chest rise and fall under a warming blanket, running the same careful, methodical accounting I'd been doing since Mark Ellis first approached me in the snow. A safety complaint filed and dismissed. A search recommendation overruled. My own daughter found in an area my father had insisted, repeatedly, she couldn't possibly have wandered into. If you've ever sat beside a hospital bed, doing the same cold arithmetic you do at work, except the numbers this time belong to your own child's survival, I need you to stay with me, because this is where I started actually looking for the truth. My father visited the hospital the following morning, and I want to be honest about how disorienting it was to watch him perform grandfatherly relief so convincingly, holding Molly's hand, telling her how brave she'd been, how grateful he was that Coda had kept her safe, the same warm, practiced competence I'd watched him bring to every crisis at the resort for 30 years. Except now I understood. watching him, exactly how much of that competence had always been performance rather than genuine care. "I'm just so relieved she's all right," he told me in the hallway outside Molly's room, his eyes carrying what looked, on the surface, like real emotion. "I know the search felt disorganized. Storms like that make everything harder to coordinate. I promise you we did everything we could." I studied his face carefully, the same clinical attention I bring to a patient's expression when their words don't match their body's actual signals, and I noticed the specific, controlled stillness underneath his warmth. Not grief, not relief, but something closer to careful management. A man monitoring exactly how much I actually knew before deciding how much more he needed to control. "Joel logged a recommendation to search the Northern Road," I said, watching his face for any flicker of reaction. "You overruled it. That's documented, Dad. Why would you overrule a recommendation that could have found her faster?" His expression flickered, just barely, before settling back into practiced calm. "Joel's recommendation didn't account for the equipment hazards back there in low visibility. I made a judgment call to protect the search team's safety. I understand it's hard to hear, given how things turned out, but it was a reasonable decision at the time." I didn't believe him, and I understood, watching him deliver that explanation with the same smooth, rehearsed confidence he'd used the night of the search itself, that whatever I eventually uncovered, I was not going to get it from him directly. He had spent 30 years managing difficult situations with exactly this kind of calm, plausible deflection, and I understood now that I had spent my entire life mistaking that skill for genuine steadiness rather than recognizing it for what it actually was. If you've ever watched a parent perform concern so convincingly that it took you years to recognize it as performance rather than actual care, comment, "The mask is exhausting to finally see," below. Molly's camera came back to me 3 days later, recovered from her jacket pocket by hospital staff, and handed over in a small plastic bag along with the rest of her personal effects. I almost didn't think to check it that first week, exhausted and still processing how close I'd come to losing her. But something about Mark Ellis's careful warning kept nagging at me, and I finally sat down one evening, once Molly was stable and sleeping, and scrolled through every photo she'd taken during our visit. Most of them were exactly what I expected: pine cones, coda, snow-covered trees, the specific, delighted documentation of a 9-year-old discovering a new place. It was the last several photos, taken the afternoon she disappeared, that made my hands go still on the small screen. Molly had photographed, apparently without any understanding of what she was capturing, a stack of storage containers behind the maintenance shed, several of them labeled with hazardous material warnings I recognized immediately as improperly stored, alongside what looked like a partially obscured shipment manifest sitting open on a nearby table, my father's signature visible at the bottom. If you've ever discovered that an innocent child's ordinary curiosity had accidentally captured something someone else desperately needed to stay hidden, comment, "She had no idea," below. We're just getting started. I called Mark Ellis the next morning, and this time he didn't hesitate to tell me everything. "That maintenance road houses the resort's overflow chemical storage," he said. "Cleaning supplies, pool chemicals, some equipment fuel. Nothing that should be dangerous if stored properly, which is exactly the problem. I filed a complaint 2 months ago because your parents had been cutting corners on storage compliance to save money, stacking containers in ways that violated basic fire code, some of it improperly labeled entirely. Your father told me he'd handle it quietly rather than report it formally, because a formal citation would have required disclosure to guests and insurers both." "And the manifest in Molly's photo?" I asked. "That would be the shipment records for a delivery your father never actually reported receiving," Mark said carefully. "If I had to guess, based on what you're describing, your parents have been underreporting hazardous material volume to keep their insurance premiums and compliance costs lower than they should be. That's not just a safety violation, Andrea. Depending on how deliberate it was, That could be insurance fraud. I asked him, carefully, whether he thought my parents had realized what Molly's camera had captured before she went missing. I don't know for certain, he said. But I know your father asked me, the same afternoon Molly disappeared, whether I'd seen any guests near the maintenance road that day. I didn't think much of it at the time. I think about it very differently now. I sat with that for a long moment, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly what my father's tight, controlled reaction to Molly's dinner table photos had actually been about, and exactly why he'd redirected an entire search operation away from the one place he most needed no one to examine closely. If you've ever realized that a parent's panic wasn't about protecting you at all, but about protecting something they'd built their entire identity around hiding, comment, "The mask finally slipped," below. I want to explain what the following weeks actually looked like, because I don't think the case I eventually built carries its real weight without understanding how much I was still, even then, hoping for some version of this, where my parents simply, finally, told me the truth without needing to be forced into it. I confronted my mother first, calling her directly, rather than driving the 4 hours back to the resort, needing the specific distance of a phone line to keep my voice level. I know about the storage violations, I told her. I know Mark filed a complaint 2 months ago. I know Molly photographed a manifest with Dad's signature on it. I need you to tell me the truth about what actually happened that afternoon. The pause on the line was long enough that I understood before she said a single word. Exactly how much she'd already decided not to give me. Andrea, you're exhausted, and you've been through something terrifying, she said, her voice carrying the same careful, managing calm she'd used the night Molly went missing. I understand you're looking for someone to blame, but this was a tragic accident, and I think grief is making you see conspiracies where there aren't any. Mom, Joel logged a recommendation to search the northern road that Dad overruled. That's on the record, with a timestamp. That's not a conspiracy. That's a documented fact. Your father was following established protocol, she said, and I heard, underneath the practiced calm, the specific tightness of someone reciting a prepared line rather than answering honestly. I really think you should focus on Molly's recovery instead of this. I asked her plainly, one more time, whether she'd known Molly's camera had photographed anything from the maintenance area. The silence that followed was longer than any other pause in that entire conversation, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost some of its careful management. I think you should talk to your father's attorney if you have further questions, she said, and hung up before I could respond. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after that call ended, understanding with total clarity that whatever accounting I was eventually going to get from my parents, it was not going to arrive voluntarily. I called an attorney the same afternoon, along with a colleague who specialized in workplace safety investigations, and I began, methodically, the same careful documentation process I'd once have applied to any patient's case file, building, piece by piece, an actual record of what my parents had done and what they'd been willing to risk, rather than simply trusting my own memory of a night neither of them wanted examined too closely. If you've ever had a parent respond to your child nearly dying with a request that you stop looking for answers, comment, "That's not grief management, that's damage control," below. Chapter 3 is where I stop hoping they'll tell the truth on their own. The investigation my attorney initiated turned up something within the first 2 weeks that reframed everything I thought I understood about that afternoon. A second, hidden memory card, tucked inside a compartment of Molly's camera bag that neither of us had known existed until a digital forensic specialist my attorney hired examined the device fully. Molly, it turned out, had swapped cards partway through the afternoon when her first one filled up, a habit she'd picked up from watching photography tutorials, and the second card contained several additional photos, clearer, more complete images of the storage area, along with, unmistakably, several seconds of accidental video recorded while the camera dangled from her wrist, capturing my father's voice, unaware he was being recorded, instructing an employee to just get her turned around before she wanders back here again. I sat with that recording for a long time before I could bring myself to play it a second time, my jaw tight in a way I felt more than consciously registered. It wasn't yet proof of what happened afterward, but it was proof, undeniable and time-stamped, that my father had known, well before Molly disappeared into that storm, exactly what she'd seen, and exactly how much he wanted her turned away from it. If you've ever discovered that a piece of evidence you didn't even know existed had been quietly waiting to confirm everything you already suspected, comment, "The hidden card changes everything" below. This is where I stop hoping and start building a case. My attorney walked me through the full timeline the forensic specialist had reconstructed, cross-referencing the recording's timestamp against the resort's own staff schedule logs, which my attorney had subpoenaed the week before. The employee my father had been instructing turned out to be a young seasonal worker named Devin, hired only that season, someone with considerably less job security than Joel Carter or Mark Ellis, and considerably less standing to push back against a direct instruction from the resort's operations director. "We reached out to him," my attorney told me. "He's willing to give a statement, but he's frightened. He says your father told him, directly, that if guests started asking questions about that storage area, he was to redirect them immediately and not explain why. He didn't know, at the time, that the guest in question was a 9-year-old, or that she'd end up lost in the exact area he'd been instructed to protect." I thought about Devin, a young man with a seasonal job and no real power in that resort's hierarchy, being handed an instruction by my father that would eventually contribute to my daughter nearly freezing to death. And I understood, with a grief that extended further than just my own family, exactly how many people my parents' choices had quietly endangered or implicated without ever considering the cost to anyone beneath them. If you've ever realized that a parent's cover-up had quietly put other people, with far less power to refuse, in an impossible position too, comment, "The harm always spreads further than they think," below. My father's attorney reached out 2 weeks later, not with an apology, but with an offer. A substantial sum, framed generously as helping cover any ongoing therapy costs for Molly, delivered through legal channels rather than a direct conversation, structured, I understood immediately, as a settlement designed to resolve the matter quietly before it went any further. I recognized the structure instantly, the same careful legal language I'd occasionally seen in workplace injury cases at my own clinic, a payment engineered to look like compassion while functioning, in practice, as an attempt to purchase my silence before an investigation could formally begin. I didn't respond to the offer directly. I forwarded it to my attorney instead, along with a note asking her to document, formally, that it had been made, and I understood, doing so, exactly how far my parents were willing to go to protect the resort's reputation rather than simply own what had actually happened. My mother called me directly the day after the offer was forwarded, her voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard from her since the night of the search itself. "Please, Andrea, just take the settlement," she said. "This doesn't have to become a whole legal battle. We can handle this as a family." "You mean you can handle it quietly, the way you handled Mark's safety complaint," I said. "The way you handled Joel's search recommendation. The way you've handled every single problem at that resort for 30 years, by making sure it never has to become anyone else's business." "That's not fair," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Nothing about the last month has been fair, Mom," I said. "I think it's a little late to start asking me for that now." If you've ever had someone offer you money instead of accountability and understood immediately that the offer was itself a kind of confession, comment, "That's not compassion, that's a payoff," below. I stopped waiting for any version of my parents that might simply tell me the truth on their own, somewhere around the moment I understood, with total clarity, exactly what 32 years of being their daughter had actually meant in practice. I thought about every recital they'd missed for a resort emergency, every holiday cut short by a business call, every time I'd told myself their distance was simply the ordinary cost of running a demanding business rather than a deliberate ranking of priorities. I understood now, holding a recording of my father's voice, instructing someone to redirect my daughter away from evidence of his own negligence, that I had never actually been a priority in this family in any way that competed with the resort's reputation. I had been infrastructure, a daughter useful enough to bring grandchildren for photo opportunities, convenient enough to overlook when convenience was cheaper than honesty. Molly's pediatrician confirmed, during a follow-up appointment that week, that she was recovering well, physically, though she still woke some nights, asking, quietly, why Grandpa hadn't wanted anyone to come find her sooner. I hadn't told her anything about the investigation yet, hadn't wanted to burden a 9-year-old with the full weight of what her grandparents had actually done. But I understood, hearing that question, exactly how much she'd already begun to sense on her own, without anyone needing to explain it to her directly. Coda, meanwhile, had come to live with us permanently, a quiet, unspoken arrangement nobody had formally discussed, but that everyone understood was simply how things were going to be from now on. Molly slept better with him in her room, and I found myself, some nights, sitting on the floor beside him long after Molly had fallen asleep, running my hand along his graying muzzle, grateful in a way I didn't have adequate words for, toward an old, retired dog who had done more to protect my daughter in 11 hours than her own grandparents had managed in an entire lifetime. I looked into Coda's history during one of those quiet nights, curious about the working dog my father had always described, dismissively as just an old mascot around the property. What I found instead was a decorated search and rescue veteran, formally retired after a distinguished career locating survivors in far more severe conditions than a resort's back roads, a dog whose training had apparently included exactly the kind of body heat survival instinct that had kept Molly alive through 11 hours of blowing snow. My father had known that history. He had simply never once mentioned it, treating an actual hero as though he were nothing more than decorative company for guests, in the same dismissive way. I understood now. He had always treated anyone or anything whose real value didn't translate directly into the resort's bottom line. If you've ever found more genuine loyalty in an animal than in the family who was supposed to protect you, comment, Kota is the real hero, below. I called my attorney that same afternoon and told her I was ready to move forward with everything. Not a quiet settlement, not a private, family-contained resolution, but a full, formal presentation of every piece of evidence to the appropriate authorities, regardless of what it cost my parents' business or their reputation. There's one more piece you should see before we do, my attorney told me. The forensic specialist found something else on that second memory card. A voice memo, apparently recorded accidentally when Molly's camera bumped against something in her jacket pocket. It's your mother's voice. I think you need to hear it before we file anything. I asked her to send it over immediately, unable to wait even the short drive to her office, and I sat in my car in my own driveway, engine off, playing the recording through my phone's speaker. My mother's voice, unmistakable, speaking to someone I couldn't identify, discussing the storage violations in specific, damning detail. Not confused, not uncertain, but coldly practical, running through exactly which records needed to be adjusted before any inspector or insurance auditor might come looking. It was, unmistakably, evidence not just of negligence, but of a deliberate, ongoing effort to conceal fraud that had been running for considerably longer than the single afternoon Molly had wandered into that storage area. I sat in that driveway for a long time after the recording ended, my hands finally fully shaking in a way they hadn't during the entire ordeal so far. Not from fear, but from the specific, physical release of a body that had been holding itself rigidly composed for weeks, finally allowing itself to feel the full weight of everything it had been carrying. I thought about my mother's careful, controlled voice on that recording, discussing fraud with the same unbothered precision she'd once used to discuss household budgets when I was a child, and I understood, with a grief that went considerably deeper than anger, that both my parents had built entire lives around a kind of competence that had never once, at any point, included genuine care for the people underneath it. If you've ever finally let your body feel the full weight of something you'd been holding rigidly composed for weeks, comment, "The shaking finally came," below. If you've ever had a single recording confirm the very last piece of denial you were still quietly holding on to, comment, "I wasn't ready for that either," below. Chapter 4 is where everything I've found finally comes together. The formal hearing took place 3 months later, a joint proceeding combining the state's workplace safety investigation with the insurance fraud referral my attorney had filed, held in a modest conference room at the county administrative building rather than any dramatic courtroom, though the stakes inside it felt, to me, considerably larger than the room itself. My parents arrived with their own attorney, my father in the same composed, confident posture he brought to every crisis, my mother beside him, her practiced calm looking, for the first time I could remember, genuinely brittle underneath it. I laid out the evidence methodically, the same way I'd learned to present a patient's case history, chronologically, without embellishment, letting the documentation speak for itself rather than performing outrage I didn't need to perform. Mark Ellis's original safety complaint, dated 2 months before the storm. Joel Carter's logged search recommendation and my father's overrule, time-stamped. The recovered manifest photograph, the hidden memory cards video, my father's voice instructing an employee to redirect guests from the storage area. Devin's statement confirming the same instruction, delivered without explanation, to a seasonal worker with no standing to refuse it. And finally, my mother's recorded voice memo, discussing which records needed adjusting before any inspector came looking. If you've ever watched a room absorb evidence, piece by piece, understanding by the 3rd or 4th item that no explanation was going to survive what came next, comment, "The silence said everything," below. This is the reveal. Curtis, the volunteer who had found Molly against direct instruction, gave a statement during the hearing as well, describing how he'd been redirected twice before finally checking the maintenance road on his own. His account, combined with Joel's logged recommendation, established a pattern the investigator noted specifically. Not one isolated decision made under pressure, but a repeated, deliberate effort to keep the search away from the one area that mattered most. "I want to be clear about something," Investigator Yu said, addressing the room generally. "The distinction between negligence and deliberate concealment matters enormously in a case like this. Negligence is a failure to act with appropriate care. What I'm seeing here, across multiple independent accounts and multiple pieces of physical evidence, is a consistent, active effort to redirect attention away from a known hazard, even at the direct cost of a search for a missing child. That is not negligence. That is a choice, repeated several times, by people who understood exactly what they were protecting and exactly what they were risking to protect it." I watched my father's attorney glance toward him, clearly searching for some response that might soften that assessment, and I watched my father offer nothing at all, sitting in a silence that told me, more clearly than any argument could have, exactly how thoroughly the evidence had already settled the question for him. If you've ever watched a room go quiet in a way that told you an argument had already lost before anyone said another word, comment, "The silence said everything," below. My father's attorney attempted, predictably, to frame the search delay as a reasonable safety judgment rather than deliberate concealment, exactly the argument he'd rehearsed weeks earlier through the settlement offer. The investigator overseeing the hearing, a methodical woman named Patricia Yu, was not moved by it. "Mr. Brooks," she said, addressing my father directly, "you overruled a search recommendation for an area you knew contained improperly stored hazardous materials. On the same day, your granddaughter had photographed evidence of those violations. You then instructed an employee to redirect guests from that area without explanation. I'm having difficulty understanding how any of that constitutes a safety judgment made in your granddaughter's interest." My father didn't have an answer for that. I watched his jaw tighten, the same controlled stillness I recognized from 32 years of watching him manage difficult moments, except this time, for the first time in my life, I watched the management fail to produce anything convincing at all. The evidence here is substantial enough to move forward with both the safety violation charges and a formal fraud referral, Investigator Yu continued. I'll also note, for the record, that the attempted settlement offer made prior to this hearing will be entered as evidence of consciousness of wrongdoing, given its timing and framing. If you've ever watched a parent's lifelong skill at managing a room finally completely fail them, comment, "The mask came all the way off," below. My mother approached me in the hallway during a brief recess, her composure gone entirely now, something raw and unguarded that I had genuinely never seen from her in 32 years. "You've destroyed everything we built," she said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. "You built it on hiding things that could have killed my daughter," I said, keeping my voice level, though something in me ached unexpectedly at the sight of her, even after everything. "I didn't destroy anything, Mom. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences of choices you made yourselves." She tried one more angle before the recess ended, her voice dropping into something closer to genuine pleading than I'd ever heard from her. "Think about what this does to Molly, having her grandparents facing charges. Is that really what you want for her?" "What I want for her is a world where the adults responsible for her safety are actually held to that responsibility," I said. "She's already living with what you did to her. I'm not going to compound that by pretending it didn't happen, just to spare either of you the consequences you earned." She didn't have an answer for that, and I watched her walk back into the hearing room, understanding, watching her go, that whatever came next for both my parents, none of it had actually been my doing. It had simply been the truth, finally allowed room to exist without their careful management of it. The resort did not survive the fallout that followed in its original form. My father resigned from his position within the month, facing both the safety violation penalties and a separate criminal referral for the fraud uncovered in my mother's recorded conversation, which turned out to extend considerably further back than the single storage violation. Nearly 4 years of underreported hazardous material shipments designed specifically to reduce insurance premiums and compliance costs. My mother faced her own charges for her direct role in falsifying records, and the resort itself, unable to absorb the reputational and financial damage, was placed under independent management within 6 months, retaining most of its staff, including Joel Carter and Mark Ellis, both of whom finally received the institutional backing their original warnings had always deserved. I want to be honest that I took no satisfaction in watching my parents' business collapse, the same honesty I've tried to bring to every part of this account. I had not built this case to destroy anything. I had simply refused to let my daughter's near death be quietly filed away as an unfortunate accident, and the truth, once it was allowed to surface fully, had simply run its own course from there. Mark Ellis called me a few weeks after the hearing concluded, his voice carrying a lightness I hadn't heard from him during any of our previous conversations. The new management brought me in to help rebuild the entire safety compliance program from scratch, he told me. First time in years, anyone's actually treated my job like it matters, instead of like an inconvenience to the budget. Joel Carter reached out separately, thanking me for including his logged recommendation in the formal record, telling me it was the first time in his career a good faith call he'd made had actually been vindicated, rather than quietly buried. I hadn't set out to repair either man's professional standing when I began building this case, but I understood, hearing from both of them, that truth, once it's finally allowed to surface, has a way of restoring far more than just the one thing you originally set out to protect. Molly asked me, months later, once the legal proceedings had mostly settled, why Grandpa and Grandma didn't call anymore. I told her the truth, in language gentle enough for a 9-year-old to hold without being crushed by it. That they had made choices that put her in danger, that those choices had consequences, and that sometimes love means making sure the people who hurt us understand exactly what they did, even when it's hard. Coda knew something was wrong before anyone else did, she said, with the specific, matter-of-fact wisdom children sometimes offer without fully realizing its weight. He just knew to stay with me. He did, I told her, and I meant it more than any sentence I'd said in that hearing room. Coda still sleeps at the foot of Molly's bed most nights, old and gray and, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of quiet, steady hero this story actually turned out to need. I've since learned more about his service record, arranged a small recognition through the county's Search and Rescue Association, and watched Molly's photography hobby evolve into something considerably more intentional. She carries her camera everywhere now, and I've come to understand that instinct, the deliberate documentation of the world around her, as something she earned the hard way. At 9 years old, in a snowstorm that should never have been survivable, without a dog who understood loyalty better than the humans who were supposed to protect her. I didn't get revenge. In the end. Not in the way the version of me standing in that blizzard, terrified, might have once imagined wanting it. I got something quieter, and I've come to understand it as considerably more valuable. I got the truth, confirmed on paper, in a form no one could ever again talk me out of. I got my daughter's safety, secured not through anger, but through patience and proof. And I got the clearest possible confirmation of something I'd spent 32 years refusing to fully accept. That my parents had never actually been the steady, protective people their public reputation suggested, and that real family, the kind that actually shows up when it matters, had been waiting for us all along in the shape of an old, retired dog who never once asked for anything in return. The greatest victory was never going to be watching my parents lose everything. It was understanding finally that my daughter was safe and that I would never again mistake performance for protection. I think about that blizzard often. Still, the specific cold clarity of standing at the base of that mountain, watching my father deliver calm, confident reassurance about something that didn't add up. I understand now that the version of me standing there that night was already, without fully realizing it, doing the work that would eventually save my daughter twice over. Once, by refusing to accept an explanation that didn't fit the facts, and once by refusing, months later, to accept a settlement that would have let the facts disappear entirely. Molly is the one who survived that storm, but I think, in my own quieter way, I survived something that night too. The last remaining piece of a lifelong hope that my parents might someday choose me, choose us, over whatever mattered more to them than family ever actually did. The end.